About a year ago, I started my journey to learn how to play VGC competitive Pokemon, and up until recently, I was determined to only use Pokemon that I truly liked. That is, until Incineroar was reintroduced into the meta, and I was forced to use meta Pokemon. And because of that, for me personally, sometimes the game can tend to get a little bit stale. So, to help break up the monotony of all of the teams, I had my moderators come up with teams based off of specific generations to challenge me, and they so lovingly dubbed themselves the Mediocre Four. We decided to do closed team sheets so that they had an element of surprise, and I had my Twitch chat pick my team before we started. And I was forced to use that team for the entirety of the battles. So this is how those battles went. I started off my challenge by facing off against a Gen 7 team, with them leading Incineroar and Comfey, and me leading Tornadus and Fluttermane. I opt to immediately swap out Fluttermane for Ogerpon, sensing the impending Trick Room, and go for Bleak Wind Storm on Tornadus to try to get some immediate damage. Incineroar goes for knockoff onto my Tornadus, and of course Comfey gets up Trick Room. I try to stall as best as I can and go for a spiky shield with Ogerpon, with Comfey using Floral Healing on Incineroar, bringing it back up to full HP. I go for Leer here to try to drop Comfey's defense since it won't affect Incineroar since it's a dark type, and Incineroar tries to parting shot my Ogerpon. The next turn, I get hit by a Draining Kiss from Comfey, giving it a bit of HP recovery and me some chip damage, and Incineroar successfully gets off its parting shot onto my Ogerpon, which will be a reoccurring theme here, getting my attack dropped. They swap in Como-O and I go for Ivy Cudgel, which is of course resisted, and does barely any damage considering I've been parting shotted. I do manage to hit Bleak Wind Storm onto both targets, which is honestly good for me, especially since one of them was a crit onto Comfey. The very next turn, I opt for a Spiky Shield to once again try to stall out Trick Room, and Comfey does go for Floral Healing onto Como-O, bringing it back up to almost full HP. I go for Leer to try to drop both their defense stats once again, but Como-O goes for an Iron Defense, basically negating what I just did. It then goes to Terra Steel, which means it further resists my Ogerpon, and Comfey goes for Protect the very next turn. I use a Follow Me to try to keep my Tornadus safe and happily take a Iron Head from Como-O. I go for Bleak Wind Storm, which of course hits into Protect on Comfey, and considering that it's me and my luck, is avoided by Como-O. With Trick Room gone, I go for another Bleak Wind Storm to try to get rid of the Trick Room user, which I successfully do, and go for an Ivy Cudgel once again into the Como-O to try to get a bit of damage in, even though I'm not doing much. I get hit by a Body Press, which does a ton of damage into my Ogerpon, and they send in Incineroar, which further drops my Ogerpon's attack, rendering her essentially a paperweight. I go ahead and Spiky Shield to avoid Fake Out and use Leer to try to drop Como-O's defense since it keeps Iron defensing, and I get hit by an Iron Head from Como-O, which does a good amount of damage into my Tornadus. I managed to hit a Bleak Wind Storm onto both targets, which doesn't do too much damage, and hit an Ivy Cudgel into Incineroar, which despite my attack drops does a good amount of damage. However, Incineroar is holding a Citrus Berry, so it will be getting some HP recovery and opts for yet another parting shot. They swap in Oranguru and Como-O goes for another Iron Defense and Protect the very next turn. I follow me to try to avoid any damage onto Tornadus and go for a Bleak Wind Storm, with Oranguru of course getting Trick Room up again. I stall by Spiky Shielding and once again going for Leer to try to drop those defense stats, but Oranguru uses Instruct, which of course has Como-O use Protect, but it does try to use Iron Head into Ogerpon, so it takes a bit of damage. I get hit by a Psychic the very next turn by Oranguru, and Como-O goes for yet another Iron Defense. I hit my Bleak Wind Storms and send in Chen Pao to try to deal with the Steel-type Como-O with a Sacred Sword, of course, because at this point, I'm struggling. This team is basically a direct counter to my team, so it is a sweaty battle. He withdraws Como-O and swaps in Incineroar to intimidate my Chen Pao to drop her attack stat, and Oranguru goes for Protect. With one turn of Trick Room left, I go for a Bleak Wind Storm, and trying to predict the Fake Out into my Chen Pao, I swap in Fluttermane. Oranguru hits a Psychic into my Tornadus, which lives, and much to my dismay, Incineroar goes for a Flare Blitz, and I take huge damage onto my Fluttermane, and a burn. I managed to hit my Bleakwind Storm, taking out the Incineroar, which means I no longer have to worry about Intimidate, but I do still have to worry about the Oranguru. With them down to Oranguru and Kommo-o, I know that I have to get rid of the Oranguru as soon as possible, since that's the Trick Room setter. I try to double into it with Fluttermane and Tornadus, but it does go for Protect, and I only managed to hit an Icy Wind into Kommo-o, which of course Iron Heads my Fluttermane, taking it out. I send in Chien-Pao and opt to Terrastalize her to the Stellar Terra to try to take out this Kommo-o once and for all. I go for Sacred Sword into Kommo-o, hoping that it'll be enough, and it just barely misses the KO. And of course, Kommo-o avoids the Bleakwind Storm. But at this point, the battle had been won, so to further vex me, my mod of course used Protect to further draw out the battle. But the very next turn, I was able to finally take out the Kommo-o, and after a battle that almost went to timer, I was able to finally beat the first member of the Mediocre 4. And it was now time for me to move on to the next member of the Mediocre 4, who was using a Gen 4 team. They led with Electivire and Rotom Wash, and I led with Tornadus and Chien-Pao. I opt for Protect on Chien-Pao for turn 1 to try to scope out the situation and set up Tailwind to set the rest of the team up for success. I lose Tornadus turn 1 to an attack from Electivire, and I'm now down to my final 3 Pokemon, with Rotom Wash trying to get Will-O-Wisp off on Chien-Pao. I swap in Fluttermane to try to start getting off some big damage with my 2 heavy hitters, and go for an Ice Spinner into Electivire, which luckily does go down to 1 hit, so we're now back to even when it comes to Pokemon. I go for Dazzling Gleam on Fluttermane, with Rotom taking heavy damage and also setting up Light Screen, but much to my dismay, a whole Heatran comes out, which of course is good into both of my Pokemon. I swap out Fluttermane to try to keep her safe for late game for Ogerpon and Protect with Chien-Pao, trying to predict a Heat Wave. Rotom does go for a Hydro Pump, which of course hits into Protect on Chien-Pao. However, I was right and Heat Wave comes out, so I'm hoping that my Ogerpon doesn't take too much damage. Heat Wave of course hits Protect and Ogerpon, with Ogerpon taking less damage than I had predicted, which led me to think that it was probably Assault Vest. At this point, I'm trying to take out this Heatran as soon as I can, so I opt for Terra Stellar on my Chien-Pao. He withdraws Rotom and sends out Gastrodon, probably predicting an Ivy Cudgel into that slot, and I go for Spiky Shield, and of course Sacred Sword into Heatran, which does go down in 1 hit as well. They then go on to Terrastalize their Gastrodon to Terra Fire, probably once again hoping that I would hit it with a water attack, but instead go for Protect to try to scope out as well. I go for Horn Leech into their Rotom, taking it out, bringing them down to just Gastrodon, which at that point they honorably concede, bringing me to the next member of the Mediocre 4, with the next member using a Generation 2 team. They led off with my all-time favorite Pokemon Espeon and Smeargle, and I led off with Tornadus and Chien-Pao. Fearing a Spore, I went ahead and tried to get rid of the Smeargle as soon as possible, and also set up Tailwind, so I Sacred Sword into the Smeargle, only to find out that it has a Focus Sash. Espeon then goes for a Dazzling Gleam, which I also did not expect, bringing my Chien-Pao down to her Focus Sash as well. And Spore of course comes out into Chien-Pao, rendering her useless at 1 HP. With Chien-Pao asleep for the next turn, I go ahead and try to get some damage off with Tornadus instead and go for Bleakwind Storm, which does take out the Smeargle of course, but does minimal damage into the Espeon, which then goes for yet another Dazzling Gleam, taking out my Chien-Pao after 2 turns and doing heavy damage on my Tornadus. Who would have thought my favorite Pokemon would hurt me like this? I brought out Fluttermane to try to get some damage off myself, and they brought out Feraligatr. Feraligatr goes for Protect, while I go for a Dazzling Gleam, taking out Espeon. They put in Furret to replace Espeon, who then goes for a Helping Hand on the newly Fire-type Feraligatr to try to help it do some more damage, and of course it now resists my Fairy-type attacks as well. I go for a Dazzling Gleam here, which does quite a bit of damage onto Furret, however it does have a Citrus Berry to help it regain some of its HP. I do go for a Bleakwind Storm, which does get a critical hit onto Feraligatr, bringing it down into low health. However, Fluttermane does go down to a single liquidation, considering she has the defense stat of a paper bag. I send in my last Pokemon, not hoping for a win here because they're both support Pokemon, and go for a Bleakwind Storm as well as a Rage Powder. Furt goes for a Follow Me to try to redirect any spores. However, since I Rage Powdered, both of us were basically useless. I go for my Bleakwind Storm, and luckily I do hit both targets and manage to clear the third member of the Mediocre 4. However, my toughest battle was just about to begin, since for the final member of the Mediocre 4, I had to face off against my VGC coach, who was using a Generation 1 team. He led off with Ninetales and Venusaur, and I led off with Tornadus and Ogerpon, fearing Sleep Powder. I went ahead and wanted to try to get some immediate damage on the Venusaur, knowing that it would be an issue, so I Spiky Shielded to avoid any poison attacks, hoping that he would target my Ogerpon. However, I predicted wrong, and Sleep Powder goes into Tornadus, and I am unable to get my Bleakwind Storm off. Ninetales goes ahead and uses Memento, dropping my attack and my special attack severely. However, Ninetales does go down turn 1 to the move, which was very much planned for because the very next Pokemon to come onto the field was very happy in the sun as well, since it was Charizard. The two starters went ahead and used their pledge moves and both targeted into my poor sweet innocent Ogerpon, who goes down to 1 hit. I send in Chien-Pao to try to get some damage in, and they opt to Terra Steel their Charizard. I go for Protect, thinking that they're going to Sleep Powder my Chien-Pao and hoping that my Tornadus will wake up so that I can start to get some damage off on Venusaur with my Bleakwind Storm. However, Tornadus does stay asleep for that turn. I do avoid the Sleep Powder and the Fire Pledge onto Chien-Pao. However, both Tornadus and Chien-Pao do take damage from the terrain that's set up by the previous moves. The next turn, Venusaur uses Protect, while I opt for a Sacred Sword into Charizard, finally taking out the Charizard, with Tornadus also waking up. Their last Pokemon is Blastoise, so once again I will have to deal with pledge moves, so I opt to Terra Grass my Tornadus to try to avoid any more sleeps. I Protect with Chien-Pao to keep her safe for this turn, and then go for Tailwind to try and outspeed the Venusaur. The two starters opt for their pledge moves once again, and this time they target Chien-Pao, who is of course protected. However, both of the Pokemon do still take damage from the previous terrain. Venusaur uses Protect the next turn, and I go for a Sucker Punch into Blastoise, doing heavy damage. I go for a Bleakwind Storm, which of course hits Protect into Venusaur, but it does manage to do a tiny bit of damage onto Blastoise as well. Blastoise goes for a Water Spout, which does chip on both of my Pokemon, and the very next turn I opt for Protect to once again keep Chien-Pao safe. The two starters once again combine their pledge moves, and this time they target into Tornadus, who does take some damage, however manages to hang on. But now I'm stuck in a swamp. I manage to get off my Bleakwind Storm, which brings Blastoise down to very low health. However, the very next turn it does Protect, but I opted for Leer to try to lower the defense of both the Pokemon. However, even in Tailwind I am outsped, and Chien-Pao does go down to a Sludge Bomb from Venusaur. I swap in Fluttermane and get Tailwind up once again, and narrowly escape a Sleep Powder from Venusaur. Blastoise opts for Shell Smash, but at this point I am in the clear to Dazzle and get rid of Blastoise safely, and just so happen to get a critical hit on Venusaur. I take damage from Sludge Bomb from Venusaur, however I manage to get off my Dazzling Gleam once again, and narrowly defeat the Mediocre 4, considering that entire battle was riding on that Sleep Powder missing. But needless to say, despite all of the teams having the added hurdle of being restricted to one single generation for their Pokemon, those were some pretty tough battles. Luckily, I was able to fight my way through the battles, despite having some pretty poor matchups, and I look forward to the next challenge against the Mediocre 4.